The first morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky, and Eleanor Hayes woke long before sunrise because she could hear soft breathing that did not belong to her. For a brief moment, she forgot the events of the previous evening, but then she looked toward the small bed she had prepared beside the fireplace and found the 3 white wolf pups still sleeping beneath folded blankets. The warmth inside the cabin had returned a little color to their tiny faces, yet they remained far too weak to stand. She quietly added another piece of firewood, warmed fresh goat milk over the stove until it was only slightly warm, and searched through her cupboard for clean linen. Instead of forcing the pups to drink, she dipped a soft cloth into the milk and gently let each pup taste a few drops at a time. The smallest one barely swallowed before drifting back to sleep. Eleanor smiled patiently. She knew healing could never be hurried. Throughout that first day, she stayed close to them, replacing damp blankets with dry ones, checking the fire every hour, and speaking in a calm voice even though she expected no answer. By evening, the largest pup managed to lift its head for several seconds before resting again, while the other 2 remained curled together as though drawing strength from one another. Outside, snow continued covering the valley, making every path almost impossible to travel. On the second day, Eleanor gathered pine needles, chamomile, and a handful of mountain herbs that an elderly neighbor had once taught her to use whenever abandoned animals became weak during harsh winters. She brewed the herbs into a gentle steam that warmed the cabin without becoming overwhelming, then carefully cleaned the dirt from each pup's thick white fur using warm water and soft cloths. As she worked, she noticed something unusual. Although they had arrived exhausted and freezing, none of them showed signs of fear whenever she touched them. Instead, they leaned quietly into her hands as though they recognized her kindness. By afternoon, the middle pup opened its bright amber eyes for much longer and slowly wagged its tiny tail when Eleanor entered the room carrying fresh water. The smallest pup even accepted several careful sips of milk from a wooden spoon before falling asleep against her palm. That night, all 3 slept peacefully for the first time without trembling. Nearly 3 miles away, life inside Blackridge Castle remained painfully silent. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood refused to cancel the search despite growing pressure from his advisors, who gently suggested that the kingdom should begin preparing for mourning. Adrian dismissed every recommendation. His instincts refused to surrender hope. Even more mysterious was the behavior of his legendary white wolf. Every evening, the magnificent creature walked to the northern balcony overlooking the endless forest, lifted its head into the cold wind, and remained perfectly still for nearly an hour before quietly returning inside. The palace guards whispered that the wolf seemed to be listening for something no human ears could hear. On the 3rd morning, Eleanor finally noticed a meaningful change. The largest pup struggled onto unsteady paws and took 3 clumsy steps across the wooden floor before collapsing into the blanket again, not from injury, but from simple exhaustion. Instead of becoming discouraged, Eleanor softly praised the little one and allowed it to rest. Later that afternoon, the other 2 pups also gathered enough strength to sit upright beside the fireplace, blinking curiously around the cabin while watching every movement Eleanor made. Their appetites slowly improved, although they still needed small meals several times throughout the day instead of one large feeding. By the 4th sunrise, sunlight poured through the frosted windows as the 3 pups followed Eleanor across the cabin with awkward, uncertain steps, occasionally stumbling before helping one another continue. She laughed for the first time in many weeks, surprised by how quickly the lonely cabin had begun feeling like a home. None of them knew that every hour they recovered quietly shortened the distance between an isolated Omega and a father whose heart had never stopped searching for the children he believed fate might still return. By the 5th morning, the little cabin no longer echoed with silence. Instead, it was filled with the quiet sounds of tiny paws crossing wooden floors, soft playful growls, and the gentle crackling of the fire that Eleanor Hayes faithfully kept alive through the cold November days. The 3 white wolf pups had regained enough strength to explore every corner of their temporary home, although they still tired quickly and often curled together beside the fireplace after only a few minutes of adventure. Eleanor continued caring for them with the same patience she had shown from the beginning. She never hurried their recovery. Every meal remained small and carefully prepared, Every blanket stayed clean and warm, and every evening she checked each pup from nose to tail to make certain they were healthy before she allowed herself to rest. As the days passed, their personalities slowly began revealing themselves. The largest pup walked with surprising confidence despite still being young, often placing itself between Eleanor and the cabin door whenever unfamiliar sounds drifted in from outside. The middle pup possessed endless curiosity, constantly investigating shelves, baskets, and windows before looking back at Eleanor as though asking permission to continue. The smallest pup rarely wandered far from her side, following her from the kitchen to the fireplace, and even waiting patiently outside the tiny pantry whenever she stepped inside. Eleanor laughed every time she nearly stumbled over the little shadow that insisted on remaining close to her boots. She had never expected 3 wild wolves to trust her so completely. One bright afternoon, after fresh snow finally stopped falling, Eleanor decided the pups deserved a few moments outside. She carefully opened the cabin door and watched them hesitate before stepping into the sparkling white landscape. The cold air no longer frightened them. Instead, they bounced clumsily across the untouched snow, chasing drifting leaves carried by the wind. Their playful energy filled the clearing with life. Eleanor remained nearby, smiling as she watched them discover the world again one careful step at a time. Suddenly, the middle pup stopped running. Its ears lifted toward the distant forest, followed almost immediately by the other two. All three stood perfectly still, staring toward the towering white pines beyond the clearing. Eleanor listened but heard nothing except the breeze moving through frozen branches. After several quiet seconds, the pups relaxed and returned to playing as though whatever had caught their attention had disappeared. Miles away, inside Blackridge Castle, the royal white wolf behaved strangely once again. It had spent another restless night pacing the northern wall before suddenly lifting its head with unusual excitement shortly after sunrise. The magnificent animal walked directly to King Adrian Blackwood and gently rested its forehead against his hand. It had not done so since the princes vanished. Adrian immediately noticed the difference in its eyes. For the first time in many days, despair had been replaced by quiet determination. Without speaking, the Alpha King ordered another search party into the northern forest. His advisors exchanged doubtful glances, believing grief had clouded their ruler's judgment, but none dared question his command. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained completely unaware that the peaceful afternoon outside her cabin had stirred invisible threads reaching far beyond the valley. As sunset painted the snow with warm shades of gold, the 3 pups gathered around her feet while she carried fresh firewood inside. Before following her through the doorway, the smallest pup turned once more toward the distant forest and gave a tiny hopeful howl that was far too soft for human ears to understand. Yet somewhere beyond the endless pines, another ancient heart quietly answered the call, drawing 2 separate destinies one step closer together with every passing day. The following morning dawned bright and clear after nearly a week of heavy clouds, and sunlight poured through the frost-covered windows of Eleanor Hayes's cabin, filling the little home with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The 3 white wolf pups had grown noticeably stronger. Their steps were steadier, their eyes brighter, and their playful curiosity seemed to expand with every passing hour. Even so, Eleanor continued, treating them with gentle caution, refusing to let excitement replace common sense. She remembered too well how weak they had been only days before. Every morning she examined their paws, brushed loose snow from their thickening coats after they played outside, and prepared balanced meals using fresh goat milk, broth, and small portions of soft meat purchased from the village whenever she could afford it. The pups accepted every bit of care without resistance, as though they had already decided that her quiet cabin was the safest place in the entire world. The largest pup developed the habit of sitting beside the front door whenever Eleanor left to gather wood, refusing to move until she returned. The curious middle pup delighted in chasing falling pine cones and studying every bird that landed near the clearing. The smallest remained her constant companion, often curling beside her feet while she mended clothing or prepared supper. Eleanor found herself speaking to them throughout the day without realizing it. She told them about the changing weather, about the old apple tree that no longer produced fruit, and about the dreams she had stopped believing could ever come true. The pups listened with tilted heads, as though every word mattered. Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked to the village carrying several handmade scarves she hoped to trade for flour. The three pups watched quietly from the cabin window until she disappeared down the snowy path. Although she wanted to keep them hidden, she knew they needed rest after so much activity and gently asked them to remain inside. To her surprise, they obeyed. The village, however, greeted her with the same cold indifference she had known for years. Some people accepted her scarves politely, while others whispered as she passed. A few children smiled at her, only to be hurried away by nervous parents. Eleanor lowered her eyes and completed her errands without complaint. She had long ago learned that bitterness only made lonely days feel longer. What she did not notice was an elderly herbalist quietly watching from across the market square. The woman had lived in the valley longer than anyone else and possessed unusually sharp eyes. As Eleanor prepared to leave, the herbalist stepped closer and spoke softly. She told Eleanor that unusual things had been happening in the northern forest since the first snowfall. Deer had begun traveling in strange patterns. Birds gathered silently along the tallest pines, and even the oldest hunting dogs refused to enter certain trails after sunset. The woman smiled gently before adding that nature often recognized important souls long before people did. Eleanor thanked her politely, unsure what to make of the mysterious words, and continued home before darkness settled across the valley. At nearly the same hour, another search party returned to Blackridge Castle with empty hands once again. Snow had erased every trail they attempted to follow, and not a single clue led toward the missing princes. Several advisors quietly suggested ending the daily expeditions before winter became even harsher. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood listened without interruption, but his answer remained unchanged. As long as hope existed, the search would continue. Standing beside him, the legendary white wolf suddenly lifted its head and walked directly to a large map spread across the council table. Instead of pacing aimlessly as it had done for days, the magnificent creature placed one powerful paw upon a remote section of forest near Whispering Pines Valley and refused to move. Silence filled the room. Adrian stared at the map for several long moments before slowly resting his hand on the wolf's broad neck. For reasons he could not fully explain, his heart beat faster than it had since the terrible storm. While far away in her quiet cabin, Eleanor opened the door to find three joyful white pups racing through the snow toward her, completely unaware that destiny had already begun guiding the kingdom's most determined search toward the place they now called home. 3 peaceful days passed without anyone disturbing the quiet rhythm that had settled over Eleanor Hayes's little cabin. The 3 white wolf pups continued growing stronger with every sunrise, and although they still slept together each night beside the fireplace, they now spent hours exploring the snowy clearing outside. Eleanor often laughed as the curious middle pup buried its nose beneath fresh snow searching for pine cones, while the smallest one insisted on following her wherever she walked. The largest pup remained watchful, always pausing to scan the surrounding forest before joining the others. One bright afternoon, Eleanor carried an empty basket toward a nearby stream to collect fresh water while the pups bounced happily through the snow around her boots. The forest felt unusually peaceful until every bird suddenly stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to disappear. The 3 pups froze at exactly the same moment, their ears standing tall as they stared toward the towering white pines ahead. Eleanor followed their gaze, expecting to see a deer or perhaps another traveler. Instead, an enormous white wolf slowly stepped from between the trees. Its brilliant snow-colored coat reflected the afternoon sunlight like polished silver, and its deep amber eyes remained fixed upon the 3 little pups. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Every story she had ever heard about the legendary guardian wolf returned to her at once. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it echo inside her ears. Instinct told her to run, yet her feet refused to move. She slowly placed herself in front of the pups without thinking, spreading one arm as though her small frame could somehow protect them. Her voice trembled despite every effort to remain calm. "Easy, please. I am not trying to hurt anyone." The giant wolf did not growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, studying Eleanor with quiet intelligence that felt almost human. To her complete surprise, The three pups rushed past her and happily circled the magnificent animal, wagging their tails with unmistakable excitement. The great wolf lowered its massive head and gently touched each pup with its nose before lifting its gaze back to Eleanor. The fear in her chest slowly gave way to confusion. "You know them," she whispered, barely believing the words leaving her mouth. The white wolf remained perfectly still before taking several slow steps closer. Eleanor swallowed nervously but held her ground. The enormous creature stopped only a few feet away, lowered its head respectfully, and quietly rested one paw upon the snow as though acknowledging the kindness she had shown the little ones. Tears unexpectedly filled Eleanor's eyes. Somehow she understood that this extraordinary animal was thanking her. Before she could process the moment, distant hoofbeats echoed through the forest. Several riders emerged between the trees wearing dark winter cloaks embroidered with the royal crest of Blackridge Castle. At their center rode a tall man with dark hair, calm green eyes, and the unmistakable presence of someone born to command. The moment he dismounted, the giant white wolf calmly walked to his side. Eleanor immediately realized this could only be Alpha King Adrian Blackwood. For several silent seconds, neither of them spoke. Adrian looked first at the pups surrounding Eleanor's feet, then at the blankets hanging outside her cabin to dry, the small basket of herbs she carried, and finally at her tired but gentle expression. Everything before him quietly answered questions that had haunted him for days. Eleanor straightened nervously, unsure whether she should bow or apologize. I found them alone after the storm," she said softly. "They were freezing. I could not leave them there." Adrian's voice remained calm, though emotion threatened to break through every carefully chosen word. "You stayed with them?" Eleanor nodded once. "Of course I did. They needed someone." Adrian glanced toward the giant white wolf, whose steady gaze confirmed everything he needed to know. A faint smile appeared for the first time in many painful days. "Then," he said quietly, meeting Eleanor's eyes with sincere gratitude, "it seems my family owes you far more than I could ever repay." In that unforgettable moment, neither the lonely Omega nor the grieving Alpha King realized that destiny had already begun rewriting both of their lives, beginning not with a crown or a prophecy, but with a simple act of compassion shown to three frightened little pups. For several quiet moments, the snowy clearing remained completely still. Neither Eleanor Hayes nor Alpha King Adrian Blackwood seemed eager to break the silence that had settled between them. The three white wolf pups moved freely between them without the slightest hesitation, occasionally brushing against Eleanor's legs before running back to the giant white wolf. That simple sight told Adrian more than any report ever could. His missing sons had not merely survived. They had learned to trust the woman standing before him. Adrian slowly removed his heavy winter gloves, a small gesture that softened the distance between a king and a stranger. "May I see them?" he asked gently. Eleanor looked down at the pups before nodding. "Of course. Just move slowly. They still become nervous when someone surprises them." Adrian followed her advice exactly. Instead of reaching immediately toward the pups, he knelt in the snow several feet away and allowed them to approach on their own. The largest pup walked forward first, carefully studying his face before touching its tiny nose against Adrian's hand. The middle pup quickly followed, while the smallest hesitated only a moment before climbing awkwardly into his lap. Adrian closed his eyes as emotion quietly filled his heart. For the first time since the terrible storm, he could finally hold his children again. Eleanor respectfully looked away, sensing the deeply personal moment unfolding before her. Even the giant white wolf remained perfectly still, watching the reunion with calm satisfaction. After several minutes, Adrian stood and turned back toward Eleanor. "You gave them more than shelter," he said quietly. "You gave them a chance to live." Eleanor offered a modest smile and shook her head. Anyone with a heart would have done the same. Adrian gently disagreed. "I have spent enough years leading people to know that kindness is never as common as we hope." His words carried no flattery, only quiet honesty. Eleanor felt herself relaxing for the first time since the riders had appeared. The fear she had expected from meeting the Alpha King never came. Instead, she found a man who looked exhausted from worry and deeply grateful for something she had never considered extraordinary. Adrian glanced toward the cabin standing peacefully beyond. "The clearing. You cared for them there?" Eleanor nodded. They were too weak to travel. The first 4 days were difficult. They barely ate, and they slept almost all the time. I was never sure each morning that they would be stronger than the day before, but little by little they recovered. Adrian listened carefully, noticing details no royal physician could have known unless they had witnessed every stage themselves. He realized she had observed each small improvement with remarkable patience. One of the royal guards stepped forward respectfully. "Your Majesty, night will arrive soon." Adrian acknowledged him with a slight nod, but did not immediately leave. Instead, he reached into his cloak and removed a small silver crest engraved with the royal wolf. He held it toward Eleanor. She hesitated. "I cannot accept something so valuable." Adrian smiled faintly. "This is not payment. Nothing could truly repay what you have done. Think of it as a promise. If you ever need help, show this to any royal guard, and they will bring you safely to Blackridge Castle." Eleanor accepted the crest carefully, almost afraid to touch it. "Thank you." Adrian looked at her for another quiet moment before speaking once more. "I hope this is not the last time we meet." Eleanor answered with gentle honesty. "Neither do I." The words surprised them both because they came so naturally. There was no awkwardness, no grand declaration, only the quiet recognition that trust had begun growing between two people who had met under extraordinary circumstances. The three pups gathered beside Adrian as though preparing to leave, but before following him, the smallest one hurried back to Eleanor, pressed its head affectionately against her hand, and gave a soft little whine. Eleanor knelt and stroked its snowy fur one last time. "Take good care of each other," she whispered. Adrian watched the farewell without interruption because he understood that separating them would never erase the bond formed during those difficult days. As the riders disappeared among the towering pines with the giant white wolf leading the way and the three pups safely beside them, Adrian turned once over his shoulder. Eleanor still stood outside her little cabin, the winter wind gently moving her cloak. Their eyes met across the falling snow, and neither of them waved. They simply shared one final quiet smile, carrying away the comforting certainty that this farewell was not an ending, but the beginning of a story neither destiny nor time intended to leave unfinished. The cabin felt strangely quiet after the riders disappeared into the forest. Eleanor Hayes stood outside until the last distant hoofbeat faded into the winter wind, her fingers still wrapped around the small silver crest Adrian had placed in her hand. She had lived alone for years, yet the silence that returned that evening felt different from the loneliness she had always known. It carried the memory of grateful eyes, playful paws, and a promise that somehow seemed larger than either of them understood. She carefully placed the royal crest inside a small wooden box beside the few treasured belongings she owned, then resumed her ordinary life. Each morning, she collected firewood, repaired worn clothing, and visited the village whenever supplies became necessary. The people there remained distant, but Eleanor no longer allowed their whispers to linger in her thoughts. Whenever doubt crept into her heart, she remembered the trust she had seen in three tiny wolf pups and the quiet sincerity in Adrian's voice. Meanwhile, Blackridge Castle welcomed home its long-lost princes with overwhelming relief. Royal physicians confirmed that the young wolves were healthy and recovering exactly as they should. Everyone praised the miracle of their return, yet Adrian made certain the truth was never forgotten. During every meeting with his advisors, he reminded them that the princes had survived because one woman, with no wealth or title, had chosen compassion instead of fear. The giant white wolf refused to leave the prince's side during their first nights back in the castle, but each evening it also walked to the northern balcony overlooking Whispering Pines Valley. Adrian noticed the habit immediately. One evening he quietly joined the magnificent animal beneath the stars. "You miss her too, do you not?" he asked with a faint smile. The white wolf gently bumped his shoulder before turning its gaze toward the distant forest once again. Adrian could not explain why the gesture brought him unexpected comfort. Days became weeks, and winter slowly settled across the kingdom. The three young princes grew stronger every day, filling the castle halls with playful energy that had been absent for far too long. Yet something curious soon became impossible to ignore. Whenever the royal tutors attempted to keep the young wolves focused on lessons, all three eventually wandered toward the northern windows. They would sit together, quietly staring toward the endless forest before giving soft little howls that echoed through the stone corridors. Even the palace servants began noticing the unusual routine. One elderly nurse smiled knowingly. "They remember kindness," she whispered. Adrian found himself thinking about Eleanor more often than he expected. He remembered the careful way she had described each stage of the pup's recovery, the patience in her voice, and the complete absence of pride when she spoke about saving them. She had never asked for recognition, never requested a reward, and never behaved as though she expected anything in return. Those memories stayed with him long after each busy day ended. One snowy afternoon, Adrian entered the royal library searching for old records about the Northern Valley. Instead, he found a weathered journal written decades earlier by his grandfather. One passage immediately caught his attention. It described how the strength of a kingdom was never measured only by powerful rulers, but by ordinary people whose quiet acts of kindness protected hope when no one else could. Adrian closed the journal slowly, realizing those words described Eleanor perfectly. At almost the same hour, Eleanor finished sweeping fresh snow from the path leading to her cabin when she noticed familiar tracks crossing the clearing. They were far larger than any ordinary wolf's footprints, and although fresh snow continued falling, the prints remained perfectly clear as though the forest wanted them to be seen. Eleanor smiled to herself. "You came back to visit, did you not?" she whispered into the silent woods. No answer came. Yet moments later she found a single white feather resting neatly upon her doorstep beside a small pine cone. Simple gifts that had not been there only minutes before. She gently picked them up, her smile growing warmer. Somewhere beyond the towering pines, unseen by human eyes, the giant white wolf stood watching from a distant ridge before quietly disappearing into the snowy forest, carrying with it the silent certainty that the bond formed between a lonely Omega and one grateful royal family had only begun to shape the future waiting ahead. Nearly a month after the princes returned to Blackridge Castle, the first invitation arrived at Eleanor Hayes's cabin. It was written on heavy cream-colored paper, sealed with the royal crest she immediately recognized from the silver token Adrian Blackwood had entrusted to her. The message was simple. The Alpha King requested her presence at the castle to attend a private celebration honoring those who had protected the future of the kingdom. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before quietly placing it on the table. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "Someone like me does not belong in a royal castle." Even after sleeping on the decision, doubt remained stronger than curiosity. Only after remembering Adrian's promise did she finally gather enough courage to make the journey. 2 days later, she stood beneath the towering stone gates of Blackridge Castle, feeling smaller than ever before. Every polished hallway and every magnificent window reminded her that she came from a lonely cabin deep within Whispering Pines Valley. Adrian personally welcomed her instead of sending servants. His warm smile immediately eased part of her nervousness. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely. Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I almost did not." Adrian gently replied, "I hoped you would." He led her through quiet corridors instead of crowded halls until they reached a peaceful garden covered with fresh snow. There, 3 young white wolves suddenly burst from behind a fountain. They had grown noticeably larger, but Eleanor recognized them instantly. "Snow, ash, cedar," she breathed. Without hesitation, all 3 raced directly toward her. Snow reached her first, placing both front paws gently against her shoulders. Ash circled happily around her feet, while Cedar leaned against her side exactly as he had every evening inside her cabin. Tears immediately filled Eleanor's eyes. She knelt in the snow, laughing through quiet sobs as the 3 young wolves surrounded her with joyful excitement. Palace servants watching from a distance exchanged astonished glances. The princes had greeted no one that way since returning home. Adrian quietly observed the reunion before speaking. "They remembered every day you spent protecting them." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "I never imagined they would remember me." Adrian's expression grew thoughtful. "There is something you deserve to know." He motioned toward an elderly royal historian waiting nearby. The old man carefully opened a velvet case containing 3 beautifully crafted silver bracelets, each engraved with the royal wolf crest and the names Snow, Ash, and Cedar. Beside them rested 3 tiny blue ribbons, faded with time. Eleanor stared in confusion. Adrian continued softly. When the storm separated my sons from the castle, each prince wore one of these ribbons around his neck beneath his winter blanket. Our search parties found nothing. We believed everything had been lost. The historian respectfully unfolded another item. A worn wool blanket recovered from Eleanor's cabin after the pups returned safely home. Sewn carefully into one corner were the same 3 faded blue ribbons. Eleanor's smile slowly disappeared. She looked from the blanket to the bracelets and back again. "No," she whispered. "That cannot be possible." Adrian nodded gently. The physicians confirmed it. The ribbons matched perfectly. The royal crest stitched into the fabric could only have belonged to the princes. Eleanor stepped backward in complete disbelief. "I thought they were abandoned pups. I never knew. I never even imagined." Her voice broke before she could finish. Adrian quietly answered, "That is exactly why your kindness mattered. You expected nothing. You did not know who they were. You simply saw 3 helpless lives that needed someone." Eleanor covered her mouth as tears streamed freely down her face. Every cold night beside the fire, every spoonful of warm milk, every blanket she had changed, every whispered word of encouragement suddenly returned with overwhelming clarity. She had never been caring for ordinary wolf pups. She had unknowingly become the guardian of the kingdom's lost princes. Before she could gather herself, Snow gently pressed his forehead against hers exactly as he had on the day they first met. Ash rested quietly against her left shoulder, while Cedar carefully placed one paw into her hand, repeating the same trusting gesture he had made as a tiny pup recovering beside her fireplace. None of the 3 looked toward Adrian. All 3 looked only at Eleanor. The garden fell completely silent. No explanation was needed. Their choice spoke more clearly than words ever could. Adrian felt his own eyes grow wet as he watched his sons confirm the truth that no royal witness could question. Titles, bloodlines, and crowns had never earned their devotion. Love had. Eleanor finally looked up at Adrian, overwhelmed beyond words. He met her gaze with quiet gratitude and said softly, "You believed you saved 3 abandoned pups. The truth is that you saved my children, my family, and the future of this kingdom. That is something history will never forget, and neither will we." The 3 young princes remained gathered around Eleanor, refusing to leave her side, as though they wanted the entire castle to witness the simple truth that the greatest bond in their lives had been born not inside palace walls, but within the humble warmth of a lonely cabin where one hated Omega chose compassion when the rest of the world had turned away. The days that followed changed Blackridge Castle in quiet ways that no royal decree could have accomplished. News spread throughout the kingdom that the 3 lost princes had returned safely, yet Adrian Blackwood deliberately chose not to tell the story as one of royal fortune. Instead, he spoke openly about an ordinary woman who had expected nothing in return for her kindness. During the first gathering, held in the Great Hall after the celebration, Adrian stood before nobles, village leaders, and trusted advisors with Snow, Ash, and Cedar resting peacefully beside him. "The future of this kingdom was not preserved by power," he said calmly. "It was preserved by compassion." Every eye turned toward Eleanor Hayes, who stood near the back of the hall exactly where she had hoped no one would notice her. Adrian stepped down from the royal platform instead of asking her to come forward. The gesture surprised everyone present. He stopped beside her and smiled warmly. "You belong here today." Eleanor looked around the magnificent hall and quietly answered, "I only did what I believed was right." Adrian nodded. "That is exactly why you belong." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor returned to her cabin in Whispering Pines Valley because she refused to abandon the simple life that had shaped her heart. She believed her role in the story had ended, yet she soon discovered that some bonds only grew stronger with time. Every few days, Snow, Ash, and Cedar somehow convinced their attendants to accompany them to the northern forest. Before long, even the royal guards laughed when they realized exactly where the young princes wanted to go. The moment they reached Eleanor's clearing, the 3 young wolves raced toward the familiar cabin with the same excitement they had shown as tiny pups. Eleanor welcomed them every time with warm meals, gentle laughter, and peaceful afternoons exploring the snowy woods together. Even the giant white wolf often appeared silently from the trees, watching over them with calm amber eyes before resting beneath the old pine beside the cabin. Adrian began joining those visits whenever royal duties allowed. At first their conversations remained simple. They spoke about the changing seasons, the mischievous habits of the growing princes, and the quiet beauty of the valley. Over time, those conversations became longer and easier. Adrian found himself appreciating the peaceful honesty Eleanor brought into every discussion, while Eleanor gradually stopped seeing only the alpha king and began seeing the thoughtful man who loved his children with unwavering devotion. Neither of them hurried what was growing between them. Trust came first, followed naturally by friendship and quiet affection built through shared days rather than dramatic promises. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Adrian invited Eleanor to plant 3 young white pine saplings beside the castle gardens, one for each prince. Snow insisted on helping by carrying a tiny shovel in his mouth. Ash repeatedly scattered fresh soil where it did not belong, and Cedar proudly guarded the watering bucket as though protecting a priceless treasure. Their laughter echoed across the gardens, drawing smiles from servants who had never before seen the royal family so completely at peace. Months later, the villagers who had once avoided Eleanor watched with disbelief as royal riders occasionally stopped by her cabin, not because the kingdom demanded something from her, but because the princes wished to visit the woman they still considered family. Slowly, old judgments faded. People who had once whispered behind her back now greeted her with respect, having finally learned that true character was revealed through quiet actions rather than cruel rumors. One gentle evening, Adrian and Eleanor stood together outside her cabin watching the sunset paint Whispering Pines Valley in shades of gold. Snow, ash, and cedar chased one another across the meadow while the giant white wolf rested nearby beneath the towering pines. Adrian looked toward Eleanor with the same calm sincerity she had first seen on the snowy afternoon they met. "Everything changed because you stopped to help 3 frightened little pups," he said softly. Eleanor smiled as she watched the young wolves playing together. "I thought I was saving them," she replied. Adrian gently shook his head. "Perhaps all of us were saving one another." Eleanor quietly slipped her hand into his, not because destiny demanded it, but because it felt like the most natural choice in the world. Together they watched the princes run freely through the valley that had once nearly taken everything from them, but had instead become the place where hope returned. And for generations afterward, the people of Blackridge remembered that the greatest story their kingdom ever told was not about a throne, a crown, or even 3 lost princes. It was about how one overlooked woman chose compassion without knowing who she was helping, and how that single act of kindness became the foundation upon which an entire family's future was rebuilt.